Here's a PAL, P-A-L, brand 78 RPM child's record player, likely from the late 1940s. I just got this in, and hopefully we'll have it playing 78s by the end of the day. We have it plugged in right now. Let's turn it on and get a general assessment of what this thing currently does. Well, it turns, but obviously it's going to need some mechanical help. It shouldn't be that noisy. Give the tubes a minute to warm up. I'm getting a little buzz at the amplifier. So the amp is working a little bit, but probably not as robust as it could be. Okay, here's our amplifier. As you can see, two tubes, 35Z5 rectifier and a 50L6 output tube. So this is one of those models that uses a 3-volt cartridge driving the output tube directly. Not much to this amp. The only capacitor I see is this electrolytic filter capacitor that, judging by what we got when we first turned it on, there wasn't a lot of hum, so actually that capacitor is probably still in pretty good shape, but we're going to replace it anyway. And we have this dropping resistor that's in the filament circuit. It's obviously still working, but you can see it's starting to corrode, so that will eventually need to be replaced, because it'll eventually just corrode away and the leads will break off. And that's really about all I see. This amp is about as minimal and basic as it gets. And of course, here's your motor and speaker. The rubber motor mounts have disintegrated and fallen apart, but that can be rectified. Okay, here's our old 2-section filter capacitor. One section reads 48, which is very close to 50. And the other section reads 33, which is sort of low down from 50, so we'll go ahead and replace this with two individual 47 microfarad capacitors. And checking this resistor in the power supply, the what we call the filter resistor that's connected between the two filter capacitors, looks like it's been hot, and on the meter it reads 21.7K, so we'll round it up to 2,000 ohms. I don't know what this is supposed to be. There's no schematic pasted inside of the record player, and obviously the color code is no longer readable, but I know 21K is too much. Usually between 2 and 3K at the most. You know, it's really not that critical. Okay, here are the two new filter capacitors in place. I went with a 1.5K ohm resistor for the filter resistor, and our 150 ohm cathode resistor had gone up about 20 ohms, and so I replaced that. The only thing left is to replace this filament dropping resistor that measures 200 ohm. A modern day equivalent would be 220 ohm. I don't have anything here with a power handling capacity to replace this, so I'll have to make a trip to the parts house in the next couple of days, but this will do okay for testing purposes for right now. Okay, I had a not paying attention moment. Normally these cheaper phonographs from the 40s have one side of the AC power line connected to the chassis. That's this metal frame that everything's built on. And I, without paying attention, just took for granted that the chassis was ground. So I connected one of the filter capacitors to the chassis. And when we tested it out, we had a little undesirable buzz and not a whole lot of gain from the amp. Well, I discovered this right here is this is our circuit ground right here. This is not tied to the chassis. So I had to make a little electrical correction there. Now let's fire it up and see what it does. Okay, that's better. Of course, not a whole lot of gain with the finger touch because of this little wimpy amplifier. And we know this cartridge is dead, so we'll go ahead and find something more modern to replace it. Let's look around here and see what we can come up with. Okay, here's the cartridge I think we're going to try first. It's a Fansteel P51-3 for 78 RPM records. However, look at these cartridge connector pins. Notice how they're not straight and they're almost touching, and they're actually loose. Well, we can't have that. I know in the past I had one of these modern cartridges that the pins were loose, and whenever I tried to slide the connectors over the pins just slid up into the body of the cartridge. Now this cheap quality Chinese crap. So I'm going to take a blob of Elmer's glue and put on here and let it dry and try to stabilize these pins where I can use this cartridge without ruining it. Okay, we have our Elmer's glue applied and a piece of old wire insulation wedged in between the terminals to kind of space them apart a little bit. And now we'll just let this sit until the glue dries. And it really is a shame that I'm having to go to so much effort on a brand new cartridge because it's a low quality piece of crap. You know, with record players being more popular today than they've been in 20 years, you'd think these companies would produce a quality product instead of this cheap garbage from China that they keep sending us. But you know, what do? You either go with a new old stock cartridge that'll probably be bad upon arrival or will soon be bad, or you go with a newly production piece of crap that's substandard. You know, all I can hope for is after the glue dries that the cartridge actually works. Okay, here's the cartridge installed. I had to use a couple of mismatched screws because the original screws were too long. Now let's fire this up and see how it does. Of course, I have not fixed the mechanical problems yet. And that's the volume turn wire. Well, it's playing, but obviously it's not very loud. And the reason for that is because the original cartridge put out 3 volts. This one only puts out a half a volt. So we're going to have to pull a few tricks out of our hat to get a little more gain out of this amplifier. Now, one of the later 78s from the 50s, it was recorded with more volume. It does better, but the older 78s are a little bit on the weak side. Okay, all of our voltages look fine on the amplifier. So what I'm going to do to give this thing a little bit more gain, this is trick number 1 that I'm going to pull out of the hat, is I'm going to connect an electrolytic capacitor from the cathode here to ground. In other words, I'll be connecting a capacitor across this 150 ohm resistor. Oh, about a 47 microfarad 50 volt capacitor should work with the negative end going to ground. So I will do that and we'll compare the difference. Okay, here it is with the capacitor in the circuit. See if I can do this one-handed. And there it is with it out of the circuit. So you can tell it is a little bit louder with the capacitor in circuit, so we'll go ahead and make that a permanent addition here. Now, for the exception of replacing this corroded filament dropping resistor, I've about done all I can do to the amp. What I have done on some of these is drilled an additional hole in the chassis and mounted a 6AV6 tube and the associated components to compensate for this lower output cartridge, but I really don't know that I'm going to have enough room on this chassis to do that or not. One day I will make a video on how to make that modification to these little single stage record players. But for right now, let's move on to the mechanical restoration. Okay, I have the mechanical end of this record player torn apart on the bench, and obviously these single speed drive mechanisms are simpler than the multi-speed drive mechanisms, so not as much to have to clean. We used our rubber renew on the idler wheel and got it looking better. In fact, we can probably hold off on having this rebuilt for a while. And I replaced the motor mounting grommets, these cone-shaped rubber mounts, because the original ones were just disintegrated and falling apart. Now we'll take the motor apart, clean it, and lubricate it with this Zoom spout oil, and then that should be good to go. Also apply a drop of oil here where the idler wheel mounts, and we'll remove this spindle and clean it out good and re-lubricate that with the white lithium grease. Okay, here we are all reassembled, everything cleaned and lubricated. Now we're ready to put the platter back on and see how it performs. Okay, there it is, and much less mechanical noise than what we had before. And maybe later I'll do that preamp mod, and I think I misspoke earlier. I mentioned using a 6AV6 for the preamp tube. Well, actually that applies to the newer models that use a 25L6 output tube, but since this set uses the standard 50L6 and 35Z5, I'd need to use a 12AV6 in this particular set, because in a series circuit we need all of our branches to match as far as current rating goes. But I'll probably make a video on that one day. I can't forget. Okay, there you go, the late 1940s Powell record player, overhauled and hopefully ready to go for another 65 years. Alright, thanks for watching, and more to come later.